Just sign the papers, and we can all move on. That was the last thing my brother said to me before my father grabbed my wrist so hard I heard something pop. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Not the pain, though, there was plenty of that, but the specific, nauseating clarity of realizing that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had been running the numbers on you for years, calculating exactly how much you were worth, and exactly how much it would cost them to get it. My name is not important. What matters is that I was 31 years old, standing in my childhood kitchen on a Thursday afternoon in November, and my entire family was looking at me the way wolves look at a fence they've finally figured out how to get through. Let me back up. My grandmother, Nana Ruth, died 18 months before any of this happened. She was 83 years old, sharp as a tack until the very end, and she owned a piece of commercial property in a small city in Ohio that had been in our family since before I was born. A strip of storefronts on a main street that generated steady rental income every single month. Not life-changing money, but enough. Enough to matter. Nana Ruth left that property to me and my brother, Nathan, in equal shares. 50-50. Her attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Fielding, who wore the same kind of brown cardigan every time I saw him, read the will aloud in a conference room that smelled like old coffee, and my brother sat across the table from me with his jaw tight and his hands folded and said nothing. Nathan was 37. He had a wife, Claire, and 2 kids, and he had spent the better part of his adult life being the family favorite, in the way that only older brothers in certain kinds of families can be loudly, carelessly, as though it were simply his natural inheritance and everyone else should be grateful just to stand nearby. I had spent my adult life being the other one, the younger one, the daughter who left for college and came back with a career in financial compliance and a husband named Daniel who my mother described, for years, as perfectly nice, which in her vocabulary meant she had decided not to like him and was being polite about it. Daniel and I had been married 4 years. We had a house 20 minutes from my parents. I had made the mistake, repeated quietly over those 4 years, of thinking that proximity meant closeness, that showing up for holidays and answering phone calls and driving my mother to her eye appointments meant something. It meant I was convenient. I understand that now. After the will was read, Nathan didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. Then he called on a Sunday morning and suggested we meet for coffee, just the 2 of us, to figure out a plan for the property. I told Daniel about it before I went. He kissed me on the forehead and said to text him if anything felt off. I thought he was being overprotective. I thought it was just coffee. Nathan wanted to buy out my share. He had a number in mind that was roughly 40% of what Mr. Fielding had told me the property was worth. I told him I'd need to think about it. He smiled and said, of course. Take your time, and paid for both our coffees. And I drove home feeling like I had just handled something reasonably well. 3 weeks later, my mother called and asked me to come for dinner. Just family, she said. She'd made pot roast. I should have noticed that Daniel wasn't invited. She always included Daniel. Even when she was being cold toward him, she included him, because excluding him outright would have been a statement, and my mother preferred to operate without making statements. But I was tired that week, and I didn't think it through, and I showed up at my parents' house on a Thursday evening with a bottle of wine, and found Nathan and Claire already there, seated at the kitchen table, with a manila folder sitting in the center of it. We just want to talk, my mother said. We've been patient, Nathan said. My father was standing by the counter with his arms crossed, and I remember thinking that he looked like he'd been practicing that stance. Like someone had told him to look authoritative and he'd been rehearsing. The folder contained documents, a purchase agreement. The number inside it was even lower than what Nathan had offered over coffee. I looked at it for a long moment, and then I looked up, and I said, clearly and calmly, that I wasn't going to sign anything tonight, and that I wanted to have a lawyer look at everything before I made any decisions. That was when things changed. My mother said I was being selfish. She said Nana Ruth would have wanted the property to stay in the family, meaning Nathan's branch of it, meaning the part of the family that she had decided was the real family. She said I'd never shown any interest in it before. She said Daniel had probably put ideas in my head. Nathan said he needed this. He said he had kids, he had a mortgage, and then my father stepped forward and grabbed my wrist. It wasn't a long grab. 3 seconds, maybe 4. He was trying to stop me from picking up the folder to take it with me, and I pulled back, and I heard something in my wrist make a sound I didn't like. I looked at him. He looked at me. And for one long moment the kitchen was completely silent. I'm leaving, I said. Nathan said if I walked out, they would find another way to handle this. I didn't know what that meant yet. I got in my car. I sat in my parents' driveway with the engine running and my wrist throbbing, and I did not call Daniel. I know that's the first thing you want to know. Why didn't I call my husband? Here's why. I needed 5 minutes to be absolutely sure of what had just happened before I said it out loud to someone who loved me. Because once I said it, it would be real, and I would have to do something about it, and I wasn't ready yet. I needed to sit in the dark for a little while and grieve the version of my family I had apparently been imagining for 31 years. I gave myself those 5 minutes. Then I drove to urgent care. The wrist wasn't broken, severely sprained, the doctor said. He wrapped it and gave me instructions and looked at me with that particular clinical neutrality that medical professionals learn to wear, and I looked back at him. And I said I needed the documentation of this injury for personal records. He noted it. Everything was time-stamped. I called Daniel from the parking lot. I told him what happened as factually as I could, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, come home. We'll figure it out together." He didn't say I told you so. He didn't make it about himself. That's the kind of man I married. And I don't say that to make this story about my marriage. I say it because it matters that I wasn't alone, and that I didn't have to perform okayness for anyone when I walked through my front door. That night we talked for 3 hours. Daniel wanted to go straight to a lawyer. I agreed. But I told him I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with first. I work in financial compliance. I know how to read documents. I know how to build a paper trail. I know that when someone hands you a folder with a lowball offer already printed and notarized and sitting in the middle of a dinner table, they have been planning this for a while. And I wanted to know how long. The next morning I called Mr. Fielding. He was careful on the phone, attorneys always are, but I could hear something cautious in his voice that told me he wasn't entirely surprised to hear from me. I told him I had concerns about pressure being applied by my brother regarding the estate. He suggested we meet in person. We met 2 days later. He told me that in the weeks following the reading of the will, Nathan had contacted his office multiple times. He had suggested, among other things, that Nana Ruth had not been in full mental capacity when she wrote the will. He had asked about the process for contesting. He had sent one email which Mr. Fielding read to me in its entirety, suggesting that there was a version of events in which my share of the property could be administratively transferred due to a technical clause he claimed to have found. There was no such clause. Mr. Fielding had already looked. I asked him to send me copies of everything Nathan had submitted. He was able to share the emails. I went home and read them in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and my wrapped wrist resting on the table, and I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as a door closing quietly and permanently. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Something focused. I started keeping records. Every phone call from my mother, I noted the time and summarized the content afterward. She called 4 times in the first week. The first 2 calls were attempts to explain what had happened with my father as a misunderstanding, then as an accident, then as something I had provoked by being confrontational. The third call was softer, she cried. She said she missed me. She said we could fix this. The fourth call was from my father's phone, but it was Nathan's voice, telling me that I needed to think carefully about what I was doing to this family. I said very little on these calls. I asked neutral questions. I gave them nothing to work with. I learned later that this approach has a name, the Gray Rock Method, and that it is one of the most effective tools available to someone navigating a situation like mine. The idea is simple. You become uninteresting. You stop being a source of emotional reaction. You are a gray rock. Flat, unremarkable, unresponsive. Manipulative people need your emotion to orient themselves. Take it away and they start to spin out. My mother spun out first. She called Daniel's cell phone, which she had not done in 4 years of marriage, and told him that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I had always been unstable, that he needed to bring me back to the family before I did something I would regret. Daniel thanked her politely and hung up, and came and found me in the backyard where I was sitting with a notepad, and he sat down next to me and said, "Your mom just called me unstable on your behalf." I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. We had hired an attorney by then. Her name was Miss Okafor, and she had a reputation in our area for real estate disputes and family law, and she had a way of speaking that made you feel like every problem was, at its core, a logistics issue. She was not impressed by my family's behavior, and not rattled by it either. She told me we had a strong position, that the injury documentation was useful, that Nathan's emails to Mr. Fielding were potentially significant, and that I should not sign anything, communicate anything in writing without her review, or visit my parents' home again without a clear reason and a witness. I followed all 3 instructions. The weeks that followed had a particular texture I still find hard to describe. On the surface, my life looked almost normal. I went to work. I made dinner. Daniel and I watched television in the evenings, but underneath all of it ran this constant low hum of alertness, the way you feel when you know a storm is coming, and you've done everything you can to prepare but you still have to wait for it. Nathan escalated. He filed a formal challenge to the will through a different attorney, a younger man, aggressive, who sent a letter to Miss Okafor claiming that Nana Ruth had signed the will under undue influence, specifically mine. This was not true. The challenge had no real evidence behind it, but it cost money and time to respond to, which I believe was part of the point. My mother stopped calling. My father sent one text message that said only, "This could all still go away if you do the right thing." I showed it to Miss Okafor. She photographed it for the file. Claire was quiet through all of this. Nathan's wife. I had never been close to her. She was one of those women who matches herself so completely to her husband that you can never quite locate her own opinion, but I had also never considered her an enemy. She came to holidays. She sent birthday cards. When Nana Ruth died, she stood next to me at the graveside and touched my arm and said she was sorry. I thought about Claire sometimes during those weeks. I wondered how much she knew. I wondered if she agreed with what Nathan was doing, or if she was simply going along with it the way she seemed to go along with most things. I didn't reach out to her. There was no version of that conversation I could have safely. In late January, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. It was Claire. She was crying, not dramatically, but with the specific exhausted quality of someone who has been holding something for too long and finally set it down. She said she needed to meet with me. She said she couldn't do this over the phone. She said please. I called Miss Okafor before I responded. Miss Okafor said to meet in a public place, bring Daniel, say nothing about our legal strategy, and listen. So I texted Claire back and suggested a coffee shop in a town neither of us lived in. A Tuesday morning, when most people would be at work. She was already there when we arrived. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She put her phone on the table, screen up, and slid it toward me. On the screen was a photograph of a document. I looked at it for a long moment. I looked at Claire. I looked back at the document. It was a letter, written on what appeared to be Nana Ruth's personal stationery, the pale blue kind with her initials embossed at the top, the kind I had seen 100 times on her desk when I was growing up. The letter expressed, in careful sentences, that Nana Ruth wished to leave the property entirely to Nathan, that she had discussed this with her attorney, that it was her clear and settled intention. The date on the letter was 3 weeks before she died. I kept my voice very steady. I asked Claire where she had gotten this. She said Nathan had asked her to hold on to it. He had told her it was important, that it was Nana Ruth's real wishes, that he was going to present it as supplemental evidence in the will contest. He had told her to keep it somewhere safe, and not to mention it to anyone. Then I asked her the question that had been forming in my mind from the moment I saw it. I asked her if she thought Nana Ruth had actually written that letter. Claire looked at the table. She said she didn't know. She said she had tried to tell herself it was real. She said the handwriting looked right. But she also said that Nana Ruth had been in the hospital for the last month of her life, that her hands had trembled, that she had difficulty holding a pen, and that in the 3 weeks before she died, Claire herself had visited twice and Nana Ruth had not once mentioned any wish to change her estate. I asked if she had the original. She reached into her bag and put it on the table. I picked it up very carefully by the edges. I looked at the signature. I thought about the way Nana Ruth used to sign my birthday cards, the long looping R, the way she drew a small line under her name, a habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. The signature on this letter was close, but the line wasn't there. I called Miss Okafor from the parking lot before we drove home. I told her what we had. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't lose that document." The handwriting analysis came back 10 days later. The firm, Miss Okafor hired was thorough, professional, and unambiguous. The letter was not written by my grandmother. The signature was a forgery, good enough to fool a casual observer, not good enough to fool an expert who had 3 authenticated samples of Nana Ruth's handwriting from the same period to compare it against. Nathan had forged his dying grandmother's handwriting to take her property away from me. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about what that period felt like, because I think people expect a story like this to be about triumph, and there was triumph eventually, but it wasn't the first thing. The first thing was grief. Real grief, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move. I had grown up in a family. I had eaten dinners and opened presents and driven to the hospital when people were sick and answered the phone when people called. And underneath all of it, somewhere, was this. A brother who would commit fraud. Parents who would hold someone's wrist until something popped. People who looked at a share of a commercial property and looked at me and decided the property was more valuable. The police report was filed on a Wednesday morning. Miss Okafor came with us. We brought the forged letter, the handwriting analysis, the documented injury, Nathan's emails to Mr. Fielding, the text from my father, and a written statement from Claire, who had agreed, after a long conversation with her own attorney, to cooperate fully. The detective who handled our case was a calm, methodical woman who took notes in a small green notebook and asked questions in the order that made sense to her, rather than the order I expected. She thanked us at the end. She said she would be in touch. I don't know exactly what I expected to happen next. Something dramatic, maybe. Something cinematic. What actually happened was that I went home and made soup and watched something forgettable on television and woke up the next morning and went to work, and the day after that was the same, and the one after that. And then I got a call from Miss Okafor. Nathan had been contacted by the detective. His attorney, the aggressive young one, had apparently, according to sources I won't name, immediately begun calculating whether there was a way to minimize his client's exposure. There wasn't much calculating to do. You cannot explain away a forged document and a corroborating witness who was in your own house. Nathan retained a new attorney. He did not retain one fast enough. He was charged. I won't give you the legal shorthand, because I don't want you to get lost in the terminology. What I will tell you is that what he did has a name, and the name carries consequences. And those consequences are currently playing out through a process that is slower and more bureaucratic and less satisfying in real time than anything you'd see in a movie, but is real, and is happening. My parents did not call me when they found out about the charges. My mother called Daniel. She cried again. This time with a different quality, not the practiced softness of someone trying to get what they want, but the raw, bewildered crying of someone who has just watched the thing they were protecting collapse in front of them. Daniel listened. He said he was sorry she was in pain. He did not say anything that wasn't true. I filed a separate civil complaint regarding my father's actions. It is in process. The will contest was withdrawn. The property is mine, equally and legally, exactly as Nana Ruth intended. I have not spoken to my brother since before the police report was filed. I have not spoken to my parents since the night I left their kitchen with a sprained wrist, and got back in my car and sat in the dark for 5 minutes. I don't know if I will ever speak to them again. I hold that question loosely. I've learned not to force an answer from it before it's ready. What I know is this. Daniel and I spent last weekend painting the second bedroom of our house. We have plans for that room now. Quietly, carefully made plans that belong entirely to us and to no one else. There were moments during those hours, the smell of fresh paint, the afternoon light coming through the window, Daniel making me laugh about something small and forgettable when I felt the full weight of what the last year and a half had cost me, and also the full, clean fact of what I had come through. Miss Okafor called it one of the cleaner cases she'd seen, in terms of documentation. She meant it as a professional assessment. I took it as something else. As evidence that when someone tries to take something from you, the best possible response is not rage, and not pleading, and not hoping they'll change. It's clarity. It's patience. It's making sure that every single thing that happens leaves a mark in the record, because the record doesn't lie, and the record doesn't soften, and the record has no reason to protect anyone. Nana Ruth used to say that the most valuable things don't announce themselves. She was talking about people, mostly. The quiet ones, she said. Pay attention to the quiet ones. I think about that a lot now. I think about how I spent years being the quiet one in my family, the unassuming one, the one who showed up and helped and asked for nothing and was therefore assigned no particular value. And I think about how the thing that ultimately saved me was the same quietness turned deliberate, turned strategic, turned into something they never anticipated. They thought being quiet meant I could be managed. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a lot of things. I keep a photo of Nana Ruth on my desk at work. In it, she's laughing at something off camera, her silver hair slightly windblown, her hands clasped in her lap. She looks like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I think she probably did. The rent from the property deposited into my account for the first time last month. It wasn't a large amount. It was never going to be a large amount. But I sat with the bank notification on my phone and I let myself feel it, not the money, but what the money meant. That she thought of me. That she made sure of me. That she chose, deliberately and clearly and in writing, to leave something to both of her grandchildren equally, and that the people who tried to take my half found out, at some cost to themselves, that equal means equal. That's all I wanted. Not revenge, though I understand why people use that word. Not punishment, though that is coming and is deserved. I wanted what was mine. I wanted to be the quiet one who turned out to matter. Flame of revenge. That's what they call this. I'll take it. Sometimes the flame isn't a roar. Sometimes it's just the steady, patient, document, everything kind of fire that burns exactly as long as it needs to and not 1 second longer.